Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Jean-Paul Bevilacqua. I'm the new program developer of webinars here at OJEN, and welcoming you all for an exciting session. I'm so happy that our two speakers are joining us here today, and I'm super pumped for you all to hear from them. It's going to be some inspiring and educational stuff. So that's what this is all about. So thanks to them in advance for being here. Before we start, I just wanted to pay special mention to what is going on south of the border. I know, we're in educational spaces and talking today about young people, and it's hard for me not to be thinking about the loss that many are feeling today. And so I did want to acknowledge that. Secondly, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement, and Indigenous folks in the past have told me to not make them rote and try to be specific, both in terms of my own experience and also what we're all here to be doing. So I'm going to do it as quickly but respectfully as I can in two parts. And so the first part is, although our audience is coming to us from all over Ontario, I am sitting right now in what is known as the city of Toronto. And I would like to acknowledge that this is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home currently to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 signed with Mississauga of the Credit. But in terms of the connection to the topic of the day, I was thinking about Indigenous concepts of the earth and the care for the earth. And as has been generously shared and demonstrated to me, that Indigenous peoples are the caretaker of Mother Earth, and have a profound realization and respect for her gifts of the elements. And that respect is based on a profound spiritual connection. And, when I think about concept of the environmentalism and the environmental movement, I think it's important for me, at least, to recognize that Indigenous groups had their own concepts of respect in nature long before the conservation movement began. And they've been observing environmental changes for generations. And that's exactly the kind of knowledge and expertise we need to tackle the issue that's at the center of what our speakers are going to be talking about today, which is climate change and the mitigation of its harmful impact. And as we kind of narrow down this land acknowledgement, I also wanted to acknowledge that Indigenous folks are often at the front lines of climate change. And we see that in this group of fantastic 7, a number of those who are Indigenous themselves. So with that, I would like to welcome our speakers. First, we have, in order of speaking, Fraser Thomson from Ecojustice. He's been a lawyer with that organization for the last 9 years. He's a settler with Scottish and Irish and French heritage. For 7 years, he was based in Treaty 7 territory, working out of Ecojustice Calgary office, but has moved back to Toronto. And his work focuses mainly on rights-based climate change litigation and the impacts of coal, oil, and gas operations and transportations on communities. He's currently leading the work on the case that we're going to be talking about today. And we're very happy and grateful to have him with us. And we have one of the 7 young people here with us, Zoe Keary-Matzner, is a young climate activist who organizes with Fridays for Future Toronto, the city in which she's based. Zoe can't remember a time when she was not worried about the climate crisis and its numerous social, ecological impacts. And when I read that part of Zoe's story, I was struck because maybe it's surprising to you, but she and I are not part of the same generation. And that wasn't my experience, that kind of existential worry. And it really struck me that, as Zoe explains, she can't remember a time when that wasn't an anxiety of hers. So we're super excited to have both Fraser and Zoe here with us. And with that, I will pass it over to them both. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, so as JP was saying, Zoe and I are going to both be presenting today. This is kind of exciting for me because I think it's the first time we've done a co-presentation. I think we planned for a couple, but they never came through. Yeah. So this is a lot of time in the waiting. So we're excited for that. I'm gonna do probably like a very lawyerly presentation with a slideshow. I'm gonna introduce the case and a few aspects about it. Partway through, Zoe's gonna talk, and then we'll come back to me. I'm gonna share my screen. And so let me know if you can't see that. Okay, great.
We can see it, yeah.
We can see it, perfect. Okay, that should have been what I asked, not if you can't. Great, so yeah, thanks for the introduction. I'm really gonna start, and the topic of the presentation is how youth-led litigation is making Canadian legal history. What I usually talk about is these 4 points, and then I try and talk about the clients and show videos of them talking, but today we have Zoe here, so that's going to be probably the highlight of the presentation. But really what I want to get into is why we're bringing this case now, like why we need climate litigation now, what the case is about, the story of the youth, why they're involved, why is this a youth case, and then the current status of the case, where it's at, and what it means, like what are the implications of us winning this case or of us losing this case. I wasn't planning on talking too much about climate change. You know, that could be a whole other presentation, other than just to touch on a few key points and assume that by this point a lot of folks know that, you know, it's the warming of the planet. It's caused by fossil fuels. We know it's happening. We know it's going to get worse. We know how to stop it. But generally, I'm going to touch on it a little bit, but probably not too much. On this issue of, you know, why we're bringing this case, why climate litigation is needed right now, there's really 4 factors that at least I see from my perspective in this case, and others see different ones. But one of the first ones is just government inaction on climate change. I've put this graph here because it's really a bad track record. The orange circles are all the different commitments that our federal government has made on climate change, about what the nation state of Canada is going to do about climate change. And as you can see from the orange circles, and then I'll give you an example here. So for the Rio Earth Summit back in 1992, Canada promised that we weren't gonna reduce our emissions, we were just gonna stabilize them. So we're not gonna grow them. And as you can see by the green graph, we totally blew by that target. Well, a little bit later on, when the Kyoto Protocol came into force in 2003, we said, okay, we know this is getting worse. We need to reduce our emissions. This is where we're gonna go. And as you can see from the green target, we've missed that. In 2010, we had the Copenhagen Accord. This graph's a little bit dated, but we have most certainly not hit that. And now we have the Paris Agreement, and that target is a lot more aggressive. But really and Canada's not alone. A lot of different governments around the world have this kind of a similar track record. And we're seeing that government inaction, unless citizens are willing to actually force their governments to act, the governments don't want to address this. That issue gets a whole lot more serious when we realize that we're running out of time. And this is the second factor, is in 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with a report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. in a nutshell, this report said, how important is it that we minimize global warming to 1.5 degrees? What it looked at is, it looked at what climate change of 1.5 degrees would mean versus 2 degrees. And it concluded that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees compared to 2 degrees could reduce the number of people both exposed to climate-related risk and susceptible to poverty by up to several hundred million by 2050. That's one of the headline statements. The report itself is thousands of pages, and it goes into really, really granular detail about all of the important reasons why, for species, for rights of marginalized people, for our climate, for the cryosphere, for all kinds of different things, exactly what 1.5 means, why it's so important. But it also issued a prescription. It said, you know, this is very important, but we also need to start acting today. We need to reduce our emissions by 45% by 2030. And it's really cited by a lot of people as one of the most important climate reports that's ever been written. And it really set the stage for this decade, the decade we're in right now, as being the one that matters if we are going to prevent the worst effects of climate change.
Fraser.
Yeah.
I know you didn't want to talk specifically about climate change, but I just have a question. You know, the phrase susceptible to poverty jumped up to me there. And then when you spoke about the rights of marginalized people, I'm wondering if you could, you know, in a time that works with your presentation, talk about that impact and why it's disproportionate.
For sure. So the way that the IPCC looked at this, and there's obviously many ways in different knowledge systems to look at this, but climate change, to put bluntly, the rich can protect themselves, and people who don't have the economic means or who have connection to land can't, if that land is destroyed, if there's a huge heat wave, they're not able to protect themselves. And what we're seeing with climate, the effects of climate change, is it's exacerbating those kinds of economic issues. So it really looks, the IPCC really looks at in a holistic manner at what does this mean both for the planet, but also for humans, because we're part of the planet, we're part of the life systems that support the planet. So it really tries to look at how this interplays with social issues. As we're seeing, there's a lot of worry that climate-related like heat waves, droughts, all those things can trigger conflict as well. And so there's a huge interplay between what's happening in human society as well as from the climate. And as the climate gets warmer, a lot more instability will arise.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we have these two pretty heavy things. We know that governments aren't doing anything about this. We know that we're running out of time. We have 8 years to go, and that this can be heavy, but it really sets the stage for the other two factors that I think are optimistic. And the first of those is youth activism. I'm not going to talk too much about this because this is kind of Zoe's thing. But you know, I personally don't think that it's helpful to be in denial of the severity of the climate crisis, but I think we can also be motivated by it. And I think we can grow that motivation from what youth are doing, youth who bear the biggest burden from climate change, but who have contributed the least to it. And to see youth who are leading the fight, who in many cases, you know, have school and other things to do, to be leading this is pretty inspiring. And so that's an aspect to this case that is of critical importance. The last factor, I guess, that I'm looking at or consider is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It might not logically flow, but bear with me for a second. We live in a constitutional democracy. So normally governments, when they're elected, can kind of do whatever they want, subject to the Constitution. So if the Ford government was elected on a platform to do nothing about climate change, they're allowed to do that unless it violates the Constitution. So we've seen this in our history where the Charter of Rights and Freedoms has been invoked to protect the most fundamental rights we have. So for example, it's been invoked to protect a person's right to access abortion and reproductive health care, where a government could take that away. The court said, no, that's a fundamental right. There's some ambiguity around it, but it's a right that we're going to protect. We've also seen that in the case of your right to marry whoever you'd like, regardless of gender. The charter was invoked to protect that. So really the question in our case is a livable climate one of our most foundational rights? Is it necessary that the courts protect that? The charter itself doesn't talk about climate or environment. It's one of the problems with it, but it does guarantee certain rights, and those rights include the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and equality rights. And so the right to life, liberty, and security of the person says that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. Well, we know from the science that climate change has and will continue to cause impacts that take people's lives away, that kill them, that it is causing huge amounts of health problems and other problems to people's security of the person. It's also impacting our ability to make fundamental life choices. So our position is that, of course, climate change impacts those fundamental rights, but it's not that simple. And that's what our case is really about. Whether the different tests that exist within Canadian law can be satisfied to show that, yes, climate change is a serious enough issue that the charter should protect it. Because if the charter can protect it, then the courts can ensure that there's a minimal standard that governments have to do. And it would stop governments, it would stop that chart from happening, that chart of continuous government inaction. Courts can step in. So that brings us to, I think JP called them the fabulous seven, or the fantastic seven, which I really like. That brings us to our case. So I want to talk a little bit about our case. This concept of whether constitutional instruments can protect people from climate change. There was a lot of discussion starting with a case in the Netherlands in 2015. People were a case that actually won, and where citizens took their government to court, and the court said, you have to be doing more about climate change. People around the world started thinking, can we bring this to our courts? Can our citizens do the same? And people were looking around Canada trying to find the right place to bring that. And then Doug Ford got elected. And Doug Ford came into a government that had a relatively progressive climate policy. Ontario wasn't perfect, but it had some decent legislation and was doing probably the bare minimum. And Ford came in and he ripped up those targets. He said, we are not going to honor those targets, and we're going to replace them with targets that will guarantee a dangerous level of greenhouse gas emissions. Effectively, what that was doing is, we know this decade, the 2020s, is the key time that matters in mitigating the worst of the climate crisis. And Ford was going to lock Ontario into a dangerous level of climate emissions during that period. So in conjunction with the youth, we came up with this case. We filed it in November of 2019. I'm going to talk a little bit more about where things have gone since then. But that's generally kind of the framing up of it. As a part of our case, the youth are going to be bringing evidence that details what climate change means for Ontario. So we've enlisted the help of 17 different scientists who are at the forefront of their fields, who've basically set out for the court exactly what climate change will mean for Ontario and how it triggers all those rights to life, liberty, and security of the person. As you can probably guess, the youth are not bringing this case to sue the government for money. They're public interest litigants. What they're basically asking for is that the government do what is necessary, so that the government be forced by the court to set a science-based climate change target and to implement that target. As I said, this case is in the public interest. The youth are bringing it in the public interest. And one of the things we're actually asking people who believe in the principles of this case, who believe that we need to take meaningful action on climate change, to support that. The court will be looking at whether this case is properly a public interest case. And one of the pieces that really helps is for as many Ontarians to say that they support this case. So I think someone's going to be sharing a link in the chat where you can actually go and sign up to a document that we would be submitting to the court. Basically, it's a petition that lists a whole bunch of people as names who support the case, and that's a really critical piece for us to demonstrate that this case is in fact in the public interest. So on that note, I'm gonna let Zoe jump in and talk a little bit about her experience in the case.
Of course. So, hello everybody. My name is Zoe. I am one of the plaintiffs in this lawsuit. So I'll start about talking how I got into climate activism. So as JP was saying earlier, I do not remember a time when I was not concerned about climate change and the fate of the world. Especially when I was smaller, I was very interested in the natural environment and sciences relating to it. And I was pretty terrified, to be honest, about the immense loss of biodiversity that would be caused by the climate crisis, and which we are already seeing. So my mother is from Australia, and I have been lucky enough to see the Great Barrier Reef a few years ago in person. And it was really quite sad, to be honest, to see something like so big and amazing just being completely and utterly bleached and killed. And I'm sure many of you remember the fires in Australia a while ago. So an area the size of Nova Scotia burned to the ground. And we've seen fires like this in Canada too, but we know that these are just the beginning in terms of climate change. So this also helped get me into climate activism. And as I got older and started attending and organizing some of the school strikes and actions, I learned a lot about how climate change is really the issue of all issues, and that every problem we face in society today will only get worsened by it. And climate change is very much a human rights issue, a social justice issue, a racial justice issue, an Indigenous rights issue, a women's rights issue, the list goes on. And in short, it will impact those already impacted by the inequities in our society. Black people, Indigenous people, people of color here in Canada and around the world are already experiencing climate change impacts, already being displaced from their homes and already suffering because of increased food insecurity. And I am extremely lucky and privileged that I have grown up not having to experience this firsthand, but rather learning about it as I got older. So I got involved in this case really a long time ago, it seems, pre-COVID. And my mother does an incredible amount of work in climate action. So we talk about it at home a lot. And I started going to Fridays for Future strikes when they got going in Toronto. And Ecojustice reached out to me after that. And so the ethic of the strikes was that lots of students and young people were taking to the streets with the idea that we can't vote, so we might as well protest in order to change the systems that we're seeing causing climate change. And I think why I and a lot of other young people started taking mass action was that we realized that fundamentally we will be the last generation to know what a partially stable climate looks like if everything continues as business as usual. So we realized we have the science, our society, we have the solutions, we know what to do, as Fraser was saying, but we're just not acting. And this is because of our governments and the huge power of the fossil fuel industry. So climate change is not about individual actions, it's about our society and our institutions. And for example, our banks invest billions of dollars into fossil fuels every year, shout out RBC. In order to save the world, governments need to actually recognize the emergency we're in and shift our society away from one that burns fossil fuels and the world at the same time, creating mass inequality, and towards a carbon-free society that works for everyone. And yet we are not doing this. So our governments are failing us. So we have to take them to court. And this is what this case is about. And I am super excited to be part of this case, as I recognize this is a really historic case. And I'm also super excited and grateful to the lawyers and all the other incredible and amazing people as part of this case. So thank you.
Zoe, can I ask you a question? I'm curious about if you could speak a little bit about how you related and formed a collective with the other 6 members of the Fantastic 7. I'm wondering about how you congealed and what you may have learned from each other during this experience.
Yeah, so really it was Ecojustice reached out to all of us, and we got together to launch the case, and they're all really amazing people. Like, I've learned so much from them. They all have like so much knowledge and experience, and I felt like really honored to be a part of that. And I'm a lot younger than most of them, so I did get to learn a lot from them. Yeah.
That's great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. And so it would be great to get to some questions. I'm just going to do a little quick update on where the case is at right now. And then we can get to questions. As I said, we did file the case in November of 2019. And right now, we're in the process of going through the testing of the evidence that we filed. So as I said, we filed 17 different expert reports. Ontario is in the process of cross-examining those experts. But so that's where we're at right now. It will be heading to a hearing in September, from September to the 12th to the 14th. But it wasn't always a sure thing that we were going to get there. When we first filed this case, Ontario brought a procedural motion, a procedural tactic called a motion to strike. This is something that we anticipated. It's something that is used often to stop public interest litigation from going forward. Government basically shows up to the court and says, look, these people are making all these wild claims that the charter applies to climate change of all things. How is that possible? There's no chance that this case should proceed. So Ontario filed that motion. It was argued in 2020. Had they won, the case would have been kicked out of court. But we were successful in the fall of 2020. We received a ruling from the Ontario Superior Court of Justice saying that not only that our case was allowed to proceed, but that it was exactly the kind of case that should be brought forward. That yes, it was experimental, but climate change is a novel issue that needs to be before the courts. And in doing so, and we were joking before the session here today that Zoe's name will be in Canadian legal history. It was the first Canadian case within our Canadian colonial legal system to recognize that the climate crisis can infringe the rights to life, liberty, and security of the person. So it was really a really important ruling, and one that we hope will pave the way for other cases to be brought forward. And ultimately, it goes back to that question that I brought up at the start, that, you know, we are facing this existential crisis. We're facing governments doing nothing about this. And we have this tool. We have this tool of the Constitution. We have this energy and enthusiasm and motivation from youth. And hopefully it works. And it seems this first battle that we won in November of 2020 was an indication that we can win. And so we'll be heading to court in September. And obviously we're optimistic that the case we've been working on for the last 3 or 4 years will work. But more importantly, we're optimistic that if we are successful, that it will mean a safer climate for all of us, and a potential legal precedent that other folks, not only in Canada but around the world, can rely on in tackling one of the grievous issues facing us in the future. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at with the case. And like I said, happy to answer any questions.
So thanks to you both, and no surprise given the trailblazing, hugely inspirational tenor of this case and of you both. There are a flurry of questions in my mind, and then some in the chat. So not to be selfish, but I'm just gonna get mine out first, and then bring in the questions in the chat. And one of mine is related to one of the questions in the chat. I'm just curious from a legal perspective, if you could talk about the difference in arguments that had to be made between Section 7 and Section 15, because they guarantee different things, and the connection to climate change. And then Nat, on the Section 7 piece, is asking, do you anticipate any arguments from the government concerning positive obligations under Section 7? So that's the first question, which is basically charter connection.
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. That's a great question about positive obligations. Briefly, the Constitution thus far has only been interpreted, Section 7 has only been interpreted that it's protection from government harm. It's not guarantee to help from government. And so there's been no positive obligations, no obligation that government help you under Section 7 of the Charter. Our main argument to that is essentially that, well, the government is authorizing, subsidizing, allowing all of these greenhouse gas emissions. You can't start a car in Ontario without getting government approval, either in the form of a license or in the form of subsidies to gas. The government is deeply complicit in allowing greenhouse gas emissions. It's regulating those greenhouse gas emissions, and it's setting a target. So this doesn't necessarily need to be a positive rights case, because the government is a part of the harm that's being caused. That said, the ability to have a positive rights case, it's something that is allowed in Canadian law, but it's allowed in special circumstances. And we believe that the special circumstances of climate change, mainly that if we don't act on this issue, our civilization is at risk, constitute special circumstances. And those are the kinds of arguments that we're going to be making. And then I think your other question, JP, was just around how the differences in Section 7 versus equality rights. And at the end of the day, a lot of the evidence that we're going to be proposing or showing is just the dire consequences from climate change. And so when we're presenting evidence about how climate change is going to lead to heat waves that will be fatal, like the one we saw in BC this summer, we're showing that evidence, but we're also showing how it's going to disproportionately impact certain people, lower income people, racialized people, people who are marginalized, people experiencing homelessness. That's going to be in the evidence that we're presenting, and then that will be in the evidence or in the legal argument we present.
Thank you. We have a question for Zoe. We have a question from Jess, a two-part. Jess is sitting here today with her 10-year-old daughter, Annie, and it's actually a question from Annie herself, and she would like to ask you, Zoe, two questions. How old were you when you got involved in climate change protesting, and who are you most inspired by?
First of all, hi, Annie. And I really do not remember when I got involved in climate change organizing. I think I was around your age, Annie. That would be like 10, 11, 12, 13, somewhere around there. Yeah. And I guess who am I most inspired by? Pretty much the other people in this case are incredibly inspiring, and pretty much anyone who's a climate activist I find inspiring, because you're kind of deciding, I'm going to take on the world because I know what's right. And so, yeah.
Zoe, I'm wondering how anger inspires you. So I'm wondering if there's anything that you see that, as much as there's positive influences for inspiration, if you see action, people, decisions being made that similarly light a fire.
Yes, definitely. I think when a lot of people feel like climate change is a really big and sort of existential threat, but when you see people doing things that you know, okay, that's going to cause worse problems for us in the future, it's like you get angry, and so you're like, okay, I can change that. So yeah, it's very inspirational for action.
That's great. And Zoe, Annie is very excited by your answer. In fact, we have another question from you, and then I'll switch over. This is from Nat. How well do you think, Zoe, people in your age or thereabouts understand the way climate change is also a social justice and global equity issue rather than simply a personal choice issue?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I think people my age probably understand that a bit more than other generations. Yeah, I know that lots of young people are very educated and aware, so it's really great.
That's fantastic. I think there was a question in the chat actually that I had as well, so I'm glad it was asked. And the question in the chat says, will Zoe and the other youth be making presentations to the courts? And my question was more general about what is your, Zoe, your role and the other six's role, both leading up to the case and during the hearings in September as well. And that's for either or both of you.
Yeah, Zoe, do you want to go answer this, or do you want me to?
I guess you can answer this one.
Okay, well, maybe I'll answer from a procedural perspective, and then maybe if you want to add anything. So all the youth in the case have filed affidavits. Those are written documents that are filed as evidence with the court, and that's really their story of what they want the court to know about their concerns about climate change, how it's going to impact them, how it's going to impact their community in the case of the Indigenous applicants, how it's going to impact their ability to practice their culture and traditions, and how it's impacting their home communities. That won't be presented orally at the hearing. The hearing is going to be about 3 days. So the youth will not be actually standing up and talking in court. And that's just the nature of the proceeding. It's an application, not an action. And the difference between that is no evidence is heard at trial. So they won't be doing that. But so I don't know if you want to add anything about how telling your story is a part of this process, either through sessions like this or in the media, or what it's like to file a document with the court.
Yeah, of course. I feel like my role in this case is also about educating people about what this means to me and the rest of climate activists. And I think, yeah, so telling my story is a big part of that.
Thanks. So there's another question for you. Asking, it's Hannah, and she's asking, have you had the opportunity to study environmental law or climate change in school?
I have not had the opportunity to study law or environmental law, but I'm going to actually start a climate change unit in science soon. But I have, there has been like classes on, I know that Canadian geography in grade 9, if there are any high schoolers out there, should cover climate change. So yeah.
It should, but it doesn't currently?
Oh, it does.
Oh, it does. Okay.
I mean, I don't know what the curriculum says, but I learned about climate change in that class.
Right. Thanks, Zoe. Fraser, I have a question for you. So we have a provincial election next week. I'm just wondering about the possible implications of this election on this case.
Yeah, so the case is against the Ontario government. We bring reports from the current government, from the previous government. It's ultimately about the Ontario government's, regardless of political party, their actions on climate change. We'll have to see, what the outcome is. But at the end of the day, regardless of who wins, our clients and the case itself is seeking that there be serious science-based targets set. And so it's a bit speculative to say, if this party wins, if that party wins, but at the end of the day, the relief that we're seeking, and really the relief that's demanded by the climate crisis, is a serious science-based target that drastically reduces our emissions, and that's what we'll be going to court to fight for.
Thank you. I think we have another question in the chat from Eki. If you win your case, which I hope you do, what would you say are the top 3 outcomes that would result from this case? Like, for example, requirements for corporations or other institutions.
So the specific top 3 outcomes that we're looking for are a recognition that the Charter protects youth and really all of us from climate change harms, that Ontario's target is inadequate and that it needs to be struck down, and that it needs to be replaced with a science-based target. Those are the tangible things we're asking the court to do. Courts are a bit hesitant to tell governments how to do those things, whether the government reduces emissions by cutting electricity emissions or transportation emissions. Ultimately, a court's going to be really hesitant to dictate to a government what that is. So our case is somewhat ambivalent to actually what happens, but it is very specific that strict and deep greenhouse gas emissions reductions need to be made.
Okay, I'm wondering, thank you for that. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on the potential precedent-setting nature of this case. So both in Canada and the province of Ontario, also in other jurisdictions, and connected to that, what you know about other actions that are going on in different countries.
So there's about 5 different cases in Canada right now that are seeking this kind of thing, targeting different governments. Unfortunately, the majority of them have not made it past that first step, that first step of a motion to strike, because there's a lot of different obstacles to these kinds of cases. But what we're hoping is that in making it past that it will be easier for other cases to be advanced now that there's an Ontario court saying that these kinds of cases can be put forward. So really the precedent setting piece is accomplishing, sort of opening the door to these kinds of cases. In principle, there's a number of specific aspects within the Canadian legal system that say, well, you can bring a climate case if it is targeting specific government action, but when you're not identifying specific government action, it's too broad. The court just it's a little bit too overwhelming for the court. So there's all these different issues that the courts are grappling with when they're dealing with these cases. But our hope is that with our case proceeding, and then if our case is successful in September, then other cases can be brought forward, that it really would establish a lot of those legal questions of, well, okay, how exactly do you bring a case like this? It would really lay out a roadmap for other cases to be brought.
Are you in contact with other litigants, either in Canada or elsewhere, to kind of do a coordination of a plan of attack or a theory of your cases? Or
well, I mean, not specifically. I mean, those cases are being advanced with their own clients and their own legal counsel. I mean, there is a lot of public coordination in the sense that groups that are successful, their organizations. There's one organization in the Netherlands that tries to coordinate different cases that are being brought around the world, so that people who are bringing them know about the international precedents or the precedents in other jurisdictions. And so they will be sharing cases around to different folks, and have been helpful in providing some information to us about cases in other jurisdictions. Yeah, so and that's really great to see, because these are big fights against big, powerful governments, and citizens need all the help that they can get.
Thanks, Fraser. So we have a question from an anonymous attendee. If a Section 7 violation is found, which PFJ, I hope you know what that is because I don't, do you think the government would argue saves their case?
So the PFJ is the principle of fundamental justice, and that's a piece of the Section 7 right. So effectively, the government is allowed to deprive us of our rights to life, liberty, and security of the person if they're in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. So a simple way to think about this is, the government incarcerates a large number of people. That is a direct violation of their right to liberty, whether that's justified or not. And in many cases, it's overused. They can justify it on the basis of the principles of fundamental justice that in Canadian or in Western democracies, we accept that governments can incarcerate people. In the basis of our case, there's a bunch of potential ones that they could use. And the three that are mainly come up are arbitrariness, gross disproportionality, and overbreadth. Those are sort of the ones that come up in basically every case. So it's likely that they'll use at least one of those three, if not all three. But we haven't received their argument on that front, so we're anticipating that they will be providing it. But we've directly pleaded that the government's actions are arbitrary and that they are grossly disproportional to what it's setting out, because ultimately the actions that the government is taking are going to lead to a climate crisis, and really it's hard to justify, hey, we're marginally gonna save a little bit of money on this when we all know dealing with the climate crisis now will save in the long term. So
I'm wondering, thank you for expanding on that and defining that acronym. I'm wondering about the argument or potential argument, maybe this isn't one, that we're talking about kind of a global issue and how to parse out Ontario and Ontario government's role within the climate crisis. So is that something that they might advance? Like, it's not all our fault, so how can we be blamed for something that is global in nature?
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of argument that Ontario brought in the motion to strike, and then secondly, it's an argument that's been used by the Ontario government, the Alberta government, Saskatchewan government when they were trying to go after the carbon pricing regime, and the Supreme Court of Canada and courts around the world kind of understand that, okay, well, if we accept that argument, then literally we're dooming everybody because no one person is responsible for this. You could make that argument in Canada. Canada's about, depending on how you look at it, 1.6 to 3.2% of global emissions. Well, that's a small amount. Well, if you got 30 countries like Canada, then there's all the emissions. And if every single one of those governments was allowed to justify it, then we would never have a resolution to this issue. So the Supreme Court of Canada looked at that issue and recognized that it's a global problem and it requires a global solution. And there can't be people who sit this out or free riders who just say, oh, I'm just going to wait till other people deal with this. Because that's what's been happening for the last 30 years and things have gotten worse.
Okay, thank you. So Nat is in the chat asking, or related to my question, are courts around the world paying more attention to one another's decisions regarding climate change, given the sense in public opinion that it's pretty urgent and that there's relatively little local jurisprudence to follow?
I think the answer to that question is yes. And most decisions that come out relating to these kinds of issues will reference other cases. There's 3 or 4 major cases that have been ruled in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Pakistan, and in the US, where courts have grappled with these issues. They're not really applying them as precedent, I would say. They're more looking as guidance from other courts. But as we know, courts can look to what other courts in other jurisdictions have done even if it's not binding precedent. They can look at what courts in other jurisdictions have done, because in many cases, they're grappling with the same kinds of issues, because there's a bunch of novel issues on this. And so what we've seen is in the past, on if there's a novel area of law, it can take a long time to develop. Over the last 7 years, really, we've seen the development of some pretty sophisticated legal analyses on the issue of climate change that has arisen through really a collective conversation from lawyers and judges around the world, where they are doing exactly that, just reflecting on others' decisions, applying it locally. That's obviously a very important part. But it's been pretty impressive to see. It's the courts, so it's happening slowly, but for the courts to have developed that over 7 years is pretty great. But obviously, there's a lot more that still needs to be done.
Fraser, I mean, Zoe spoke about how within your generation, Zoe, that it's cared about, and there's an awareness piece. I'm curious, Fraser, if you've noticed in your work a shift that Matt is referencing there in public opinion, public awareness, public investment in tackling this issue.
I think so. It's interesting because part of the time I was working was in Alberta, and where conventionally you might expect that there'd be less attention paid to these issues. That said, there's a lot of really great people doing this work in Alberta, and I think what we're realizing is, there's always been people that have cared about these issues, always been, but what we're seeing now is the scale and severity of the impacts, how it's not a, oh, that would be nice. It's a, oh, wow, we're not going to survive this unless we do this. And that's been the reality for a lot of people that are marginalized in our society. It's always been a threat to Indigenous communities. But I think people who are pretty privileged are now realizing that their way of life is at stake. And that's obviously changing the way banks operate and changing the way some pretty powerful institutions operate. I think what would be unfortunate is if we don't incorporate principles of justice into how we solve this issue, because banks care about climate change now, because of those things. Like we need to make sure that the underlying inequity that led to it is resolved through any solutions that we have to the climate crisis. Because if not, it's just going to be on to the next issue that arises from imbalance in power in our society.
Can you that's super interesting to me. Can you just expand or make the connection to, I think what you're talking about is big structural change and kind of maybe dismantling systems of power that exist right now because it's all interconnected. But please correct me if I'm wrong.
I mean, in terms of what our case is about, our case is not necessarily about that by any means. Our case is about the target that the Ontario government has set. I think in terms of the way that the question being more broadly about, what people are concerned about, I think people are starting to make that connection a lot more. And I think the issue of climate change is an opportunity to start to reflect on more systemic change, but our case is a legal case that operates within the Canadian legal system, and that's a system that can change. But certainly our case isn't necessarily going to be about that. Unfortunately, it's what we're asking for is that the target be changed. And yeah.
Thank you, Zoe. I have two kind of concluding questions for you. One is more personal in nature and one is professional. So please take them in the order that you'd like. I'm wondering, because you spoke about both the individual collective consciousness, maybe anxiety around the climate crisis. What are tools that you found personally useful to counteract that, to keep the hope, keep the drive engender joy in your day-to-day life, because I think young people would benefit from hearing from someone who's deeply involved and invested in this type of heavy work. The second is I'm interested about your, I know you're young, but when you envision your career path and going forward, how this issue connects or doesn't connect, and how you want to integrate the two.
Of course. I guess I'll answer in terms of what to do if you're worried about climate change. What I find really helpful is just taking action, just like any action that you could possibly think of. And especially when I joined like local groups, when I joined a group, when you surround yourself with like so many other people who care about this issue and are working towards something sustainable, then it really helps. Yeah. And in terms of what I want to go into the nerdy sciences. So it sort of connects with climate change in the way that I'm interested in wildlife biology, which is, biology and biodiversity. If we like continue to warm up the planet, then the impacts for ecosystems around the world are going to be ginormous. So that would definitely come up a lot if I go there.
Zoe, are there nerdy and cool sciences? That sounds pretty cool to me.
I think nerdy and cool are synonyms, to be honest.
Great. I love that. Yeah, because that sounds fascinating to me. I'm so glad that field is potentially going to have you among their ranks. Well, Fraser, Zoe, thank you so much for your time. I know that our audience has gleaned so much from hearing about your journey to this moment. And I know that personally, and they as well, are thinking of you and wishing you the best. I will, in addition to the well wishes, remind people about the link to be more public and actionable in terms of your support for this case as it heads to its hearings in September. I want to thank my OJEN colleagues, Rara Cesara and Chrissy Pagnuti, who have been doing great work behind the scenes, as well as Sean from Ecojustice, who was really helpful in setting this up too. Thank our audience for being here and for their wonderful questions, and wishing you all a great rest of your week. Thank you.